don't know anything about the robbery. They know now. And kids grow up, John. Kids develop consciences and start asking uncomfortable questions about where their daddy got his money. Frank stood and drew his pistol. Better to solve the problem while it's still manageable. Maggie watched her uncle, the man who'd bounced her on his knee and taught her to whistle, aim his gun at her mother's head. The transformation was so complete, so absolute, that she wondered if she'd ever really known Frank Morrison at all. But her father had one last card to play. "The gold isn't under the barn, Frank. I lied about that." Frank paused, gun still, trained on her mother. "Where is it?" "Hidden where you'll never find it without me. Kill us, and you'll spend the rest of your life digging holes in Wyoming dirt. I'll find it eventually. Maybe, but how long will it take? How many months or years will you waste searching while the Pinkertons close in?" Her father's voice grew stronger. "Let Maggie and Elizabeth go, and I'll take you to the gold right now." Frank considered this for a long moment, his gun moving. Between Maggie and her mother, like he was weighing their lives against the convenience of having the golds. Location, immediately. "All right, John. But if you're lying to me again, I'll make sure your wife and daughter die very slowly before I kill you." They walked through the pre-dawn darkness toward the creek that ran through their property, Frank's men surrounding them, with rifles, while the two brothers led the way. Maggie held her mother's hand and tried to prepare herself for whatever was coming. Her father led them to a bend in the creek where an old cottonwood had fallen across the water years earlier. Beneath the log, partially submerged in creek bed gravel, was a metal strong box that took 3 men to lift. 30,000 in federal gold certificates, her father said, as Frank pried open the lock. "Just like we took from the Pinkerton transport." Frank examined the contents by lantern light, counting stacks of government notes and gold pieces. His men gathered around him, their attention focused on wealth most of them had never seen in one place. It was the distraction her father had been waiting for. John Morrison launched himself at his brother with the desperate strength of a man, fighting for his family's life. They went down in a tangle of limbs and cursing, John's hands seeking Frank's throat, while Frank tried to bring his gun to bear. "Run!" her father shouted to Maggie and her mother. "Get to the trees." Elizabeth Morrison grabbed Maggie's hand, and they ran toward the creek bank, stumbling through darkness, while gunfire erupted behind them. Maggie looked back once and saw her father and uncle rolling on the ground, both men fighting for control of Frank's pistol. They made it to the cover of willow trees along the creek before Frank's men recovered from their surprise and began shooting. Bullets whined through the branches around them as they scrambled deeper into the undergrowth, following the creek away from the house. Behind them, the gunfire stopped abruptly, replaced by Frank's voice calling orders to his men. A few seconds later, a single pistol shot echoed across the water. Maggie's mother made a sound like a wounded animal and stumbled, her grip on Maggie's hand going slack. For a moment, Maggie thought her mother had been shot. Then she realized Elizabeth Morrison had simply understood what that final gunshot meant. "Mama, we have to keep moving." Her mother knelt in the mud beside the creek, staring back toward where her husband had died trying to save them. "He's gone, Maggie. Your papa's gone." "I know, Mama, but he told us to run, and that's what we have to do." They followed the creek for what felt like hours, moving as quietly as possible through terrain that was familiar in daylight, but alien in darkness. Behind them they could hear Frank's men searching, their voices carrying across the water as they organized a pursuit. Fan out along the creek. They can't have gotten far. What about the bodies? You want us to bury them? Leave them for the coyotes. We need to find the woman and the girl before daylight. Maggie felt hatred crystallizing in her chest, cold and pure as mountain ice. Frank Morrison had murdered her father in cold blood, and now spoke of leaving his body unburied like he was. Garbage. Her uncle had become something monstrous, and she swore to herself that someday she would make him pay for what he'd done. But first she had to survive long enough to grow up. They found shelter in a shallow cave carved into the creek bank by spring floods, a hiding place Maggie remembered from childhood games of hide-and-seek. It was barely large enough for both of them, but it was concealed from casual observation, and far enough from the creek to muffle the sound of their breathing. Her mother was in shock, staring at nothing while tears streamed down her face. The strong, capable woman who'd run their household and helped manage the ranch had been broken by watching her husband die. She needed medical attention, needed warmth and comfort and time to process what had happened. Instead, she had a 12-year-old daughter and a muddy hole in a creek bank while murderers searched for them in the darkness. "Mama, I need you to listen to me," Maggie whispered. "I need you to stay quiet and stay hidden until I come back." Her mother's eyes focused on her for the first time since her father's death. "Where are you going?" "To get help. The Hendersons have a ranch 5 miles downstream. If I follow the creek, I can get there before noon and bring back men with guns. It's too dangerous. Frank's men are searching for 2 people together. They won't expect a child traveling alone." Maggie squeezed her mother's hands. "Mama, you taught me to be strong when things get difficult. This is me being strong." Elizabeth Morrison pulled her daughter against her chest, holding her tight enough that Maggie could feel her heart racing with fear and grief. "If something happens to me," her mother whispered, "if Frank finds me before you get back, I want you to promise me something." "Mama, promise me you won't try to get revenge. Promise me you'll build a good life somewhere far away from here and forget about Frank Morrison." Maggie pulled back to look at her mother's face in the dim light, filtering into their hiding place. She saw a woman trying to save her daughter from the hatred that was already taking root in a 12-year-old's heart. "I promise, Mama." It was the first lie she'd ever told her mother, and they both knew it. Maggie kissed her mother's forehead and crawled out of the cave into the pre-dawn darkness. Behind her she could hear her mother beginning to cry again. Soft, broken sounds that cut through Maggie's heart like knives. She followed the creek downstream, moving from shadow to shadow, staying low and quiet while Frank's men continued their search upstream. The water was cold against her bare feet, but it muffled her footsteps and would make tracking difficult if they brought dogs. As the sun rose, she could see smoke from their ranch house burning in the distance. Frank Morrison was destroying evidence, making sure nothing connected him to the Morrison family ranch or the federal gold he'd stolen from his murdered brother. The journey to the Henderson ranch took 6 hours of careful movement through country that was probably crawling with Frank's men. When she finally stumbled into their yard, exhausted and covered in mud, Mrs. Henderson took one look at her and immediately began preparing for trouble. "Child, what's happened? Where are your parents?" "Dead. Uncle Frank killed them for stolen gold, Mama's hiding by the creek, and Frank's men are hunting for us. Tom Henderson was a cattleman, not a gunfighter, but he was decent people who understood that some situations required men to stand up and fight regardless of the odds. He gathered his 4 ranch hands, and they rode toward the Morrison place. With rifles and grim determination, they found Elizabeth Morrison's body floating in the creek 2 miles from where Maggie had left her. She'd been shot twice in the back while trying to escape the cave where her daughter had hidden her. They found John Morrison's body beside the strongbox, which had been emptied of its federal gold. He'd been shot once through the heart at close range. They didn't find Frank Morrison or any of his men. By the time the Henderson party reached the Morrison ranch, the killers had vanished into the Wyoming wilderness, taking $30,000 in stolen gold and leaving behind nothing but ashes and blood. Tom Henderson took Maggie into his family and raised her like his own daughter, but he could see the change that had taken place in her during those terrible hours. The laughing child who'd visited their ranch with her parents was gone, replaced by someone older and harder and focused on purposes that had nothing to do with normal childhood. She learned everything she could about tracking, shooting, and survival. She studied maps and memorized the names of towns where Frank Morrison might surface. She saved every penny she could get her hands on, preparing for the day when she would leave the Henderson ranch and begin hunting her parents' killer. But she also kept the promise she'd made to her mother. In a way, she didn't try to get revenge immediately. Instead, she got an education, learned useful skills, and built a respectable life as far away from Wyoming as she could manage. She became Dr. Margaret Hayes, one of the first women physicians in the Colorado Territory, establishing a practice that served mining camps and cattle towns throughout the region. She saved lives, delivered babies, set broken bones, and earned the respect of communities that weren't accustomed to taking orders from women. And while the doctor's choice, the scalpel trembled in Dr. Margaret Hayes's hand as she stared down at the unconscious man on her operating table. Blood pooled beneath his shoulder, where a rifle bullet had torn through muscle and bone. But that wasn't what made her hesitate. It was the face she recognized, despite 15 years of aging and the hard lines that frontier life had carved around his eyes. Frank Morrison lay bleeding on her table. The same Frank Morrison who'd burned her family's ranch, killed her parents, and left her for dead when she was 12 years old. The man she'd spent every day since then preparing to kill was now completely at her mercy, his life hanging by the thread of her Hippocratic oath. Outside her clinic, 3 of Morrison's men waited with their hands on their guns, ready to shoot her if their boss died under her knife. Inside, her medical training warred with 15 years of carefully nurtured hatred. While the clock on her wall marked the minutes, she had to decide whether to save the life of her parents, murderer, or let him bleed to death and face the consequences. But the choice Margaret thought she was making, save him or let him die, wasn't the real choice at all, because Frank Morrison hadn't come to her clinic by accident, and the bullet wound in his shoulder wasn't from a random shootout with rivals or lawmen. He'd orchestrated this entire situation to force a confrontation with the doctor he'd heard was asking too many questions about old crimes in Sweetwater County. What Margaret didn't know yet was that Morrison had spent years tracking her movements, learning about her medical practice, waiting for the perfect moment to eliminate the last witness to his family's massacre. The wounded outlaw on her table wasn't seeking healing, he was setting a trap. But to understand why Frank Morrison was willing to risk his life to silence one frontier doctor, we need to go back to the night that made Margaret Hayes into both a healer and a killer. Back to when she was just a 12-year-old girl named Maggie Morrison. Yes, Morrison, because the man bleeding on her table had once been her uncle, her father's brother, and the person she'd trusted most in the world before he revealed what family loyalty meant to men who valued gold more than blood. Sweetwater Valley, Wyoming Territory, 1878. 12-year-old Maggie Morrison pressed her face against her bedroom window, watching the riders approach their ranch house through the pre-dawn darkness. 6 men on horseback, moving with the careful deliberation of people who didn't want to be seen or heard. She counted the silhouettes against the starlight and felt ice forming in her stomach. Her father had been expecting trouble. For weeks he'd been checking the locks on doors and windows, cleaning his rifles more often than usual, and holding whispered conversations with her mother that stopped whenever Maggie entered the room. She'd heard fragments, words like shares, double cross, and blood money, but she'd never understood what they meant. Now, watching 6 armed men surround their house while her parents slept, she began to understand that whatever her father had been worried about was finally happening. The lead rider dismounted near the front porch, and moonlight caught his face clearly for the first time. Maggie's relief was immediate and overwhelming. It was Uncle Frank, her father's younger brother, the man who'd taught her to ride and shoot, and who brought her penny candy whenever he visited from his wanderings around the territory. She started to call out to him, to warn him that her father was expecting trouble and might shoot before recognizing family. But something in Frank's posture made her hesitate. He moved like the other riders, careful, predatory, focused on the house, like men planning violence, rather than family members coming for a visit. Maggie pulled back from the window and crept toward her parents' bedroom, intending to wake them, and let them know Frank was outside. But voices from the front porch stopped her cold. "You sure about this, Frank?" One of the riders had joined Uncle Frank near the front door. "He's your brother." "Half-brother," Frank replied, his voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. "And he made his choice when he decided to keep all the Pinkertons' gold instead of splitting it like we agreed." Maggie crouched in the hallway, understanding, flooding through her like cold water. Her father hadn't been worried about strangers coming to hurt their family. He'd been worried about his own brother. "What about the girl?" the rider asked. "What about her? She's 12 years old. She doesn't know anything." "Kids talk, Frank. Kids grow up and remember things." Frank was quiet for a moment, and Maggie held her breath, waiting for him to defend her, to insist she was family and deserved protection. "Then we make sure she doesn't remember anything," he said finally. Maggie ran. She burst into her parents' bedroom without knocking, shaking her father's shoulder until he woke with the startled alertness of a man who'd been sleeping lightly. "Papa, Uncle Frank's here with 5 other men. They're talking about Pinkerton gold and making sure I don't remember anything." Her father was out of bed instantly, grabbing his rifle from the corner, while her mother lit the lamp with shaking hands. "Elizabeth, get Maggie out the back window and to the root cellar. Stay there until you hear me call for you, or until the sun comes up, whichever happens first." "John, what's this about?" Her mother whispered. "It's about $30,000 in Pinkerton gold," that Frank and I stole from a federal transport 6 months ago. I've been holding it, planning to split it with him when things cooled down." Her father checked his rifle's load, his face grim in the lamplight. Apparently he decided he'd rather have it all. Maggie felt the world shifting around her as she learned that her father was a thief and her uncle was a murderer, that the family she'd trusted was built on lies and violence. But there was no time to process the revelation. Frank's voice was calling from outside. "John, I know you're awake in there. Come out and let's talk about this like family." Her father positioned himself at the bedroom window, using the frame as cover while he aimed his rifle toward the front porch. "Take Maggie and go, Elizabeth. This is between me and Frank." But it was too late for escape. As her mother helped Maggie toward the back window, lanterns began appearing around the house. Frank had positioned his men to cover all the exits, turning their home into a trap. "John Morrison," Frank called again, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You've got 1 minute to come out with the gold, or I'm going to burn this house down around your family." Her father's response was a rifle shot that shattered one of Frank's lanterns and sent the men outside scrambling for cover. Answering gunfire erupted immediately, bullets punching through the wooden walls of their house like it was made of paper. "The root cellar," her mother said, pushing Maggie toward the kitchen. "We can get there through the back door if we're quick." They made it halfway across the kitchen before the front door exploded inward, and Frank Morrison stepped into their home with a smoking shotgun in his hands. Behind him came 2 of his men, their rifles trained on Maggie and her mother. "Where's the gold, John?" Frank called toward the bedroom where gunfire continued sporadically. "Go to hell, Frank." "Wrong answer, brother." Frank Morrison looked directly at Maggie, and she saw something in his eyes that she'd never seen before. The complete absence of the uncle who'd taught her to braid rope and told her stories about his adventures. This was a stranger wearing a familiar face, and that stranger was capable of anything. "John, I've got your wife and daughter here in the kitchen. You want to reconsider your position on sharing that gold?" The gunfire from the bedroom stopped. After a moment, her father's voice carried through the house, hollow with defeat. "Let them go, Frank. The gold's buried under the barn. I'll show you where." "I'm sure you will. But first, we're all going to have a family discussion about loyalty and consequences." What happened next would haunt Maggie for the rest of her life. Frank Morrison gathered his family in their own living room and explained, with the patient tone of a teacher, exactly why he was going to kill them all. "The problem with family," he said, settling into her father's favorite chair while his men kept guns trained on them, "is that family expects special treatment. They think blood means something, that it creates obligations and protections." Her father sat on the sofa with his arm around her mother, both of them trying to shield Maggie from what was coming. But she could see everything from her position. Between them could see the cold calculation in Frank's eyes as he planned their deaths. "But blood doesn't mean anything, John. Not when there's $30,000 involved. Not when you decide to cheat your own brother out of his fair share. I wasn't cheating you, Frank. I was protecting us both. The Pinkertons are still looking for that gold, and the territorial marshals have been asking questions. I wanted to wait until the heat died down before we split it." Frank laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "The heat's never going to die down, John. We killed 4 federal agents during that robbery. They're going to keep looking until they find us or until we're both dead. All the more reason to be careful. All the more reason to eliminate. Witnesses. Frank's gaze shifted to Maggie and her mother, starting with family members who might get ideas about turning us in for the reward money. Her father's arm tightened around her mother. Frank, they're innocent. She built her medical career. She also built something else, a network of contacts and informants who kept track of Frank Morrison's movements throughout the West. She learned about his crimes, his associates, his methods of operation. She documented everything, building a case that could someday be used to bring him to justice. But more than anything else, she prepared herself to kill him, because the promise she'd made to her mother about not seeking revenge had been the desperate lie of a 12-year-old girl trying to comfort a dying woman. Margaret Hayes had every intention of finding Frank Morrison and making him pay for what he'd done to her family. She just planned to do it with the surgical precision of a trained physician rather than the clumsy violence of a vengeful child. And now, 15 years later, Frank Morrison lay unconscious on her operating table with a bullet wound that would kill him without immediate medical intervention. The man who'd murdered her parents and destroyed her childhood was completely at her mercy, his life hanging by threads she could either strengthen or cut. The choice should have been simple. Let him die and claim justice for her family's murder. But Margaret Hayes had taken an oath to preserve life, and 15 years of medical practice had taught her that every life had value, even the lives of evil men. Her training warred with her hatred. Her professional ethics struggled against her personal need for revenge. And outside her clinic, 3 of Morrison's men waited with their hands on their guns, ready to kill her if their boss died under her knife. What Margaret didn't know was that Frank Morrison had orchestrated this entire situation. The bullet wound was real, but it wasn't from a gunfight with rivals or lawmen. He'd had one of his own men shoot him, creating an injury that would require immediate medical attention and force him into the clinic of the doctor who'd been asking too many questions about old crimes. Frank Morrison had come to Sweetwater, not as a patient seeking healing, but as a predator setting a trap for the last witness to his family's massacre. He planned to recover from his wound and then eliminate Dr. Margaret Hayes permanently, ending the threat she represented to his criminal empire. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated how much the 12-year-old girl he'd thought was dead had learned during 15 years of preparing for this moment. Margaret Hayes wasn't just a physician torn between her oath and her desire for revenge. She was a hunter who'd finally cornered her prey, and she had plans that went far beyond simply letting Frank Morrison lead to death on her operating table. The real choice she faced wasn't whether to save him or let him die. It was whether to kill him quickly with mercy or slowly with justice. And Dr. Margaret Hayes had very definite ideas about which option Frank Morrison deserved. Margaret forced her hands to steady as she examined the bullet wound in Morrison's shoulder. The injury was serious but not immediately life-threatening. The bullet had missed major arteries and vital organs. With proper treatment, he would make a full recovery. Without treatment, he would likely die from blood loss within the hour. She looked down at his unconscious face, noting how 15 years of criminal life had hardened his features. The uncle she remembered from childhood had been handsome in a rough way, with laugh lines around his eyes and a smile that made people trust him. This man looked like what he was, a killer who'd spent decades hurting people for profit. But she could still see traces of the man who'd taught her to ride, who'd brought her candy, and told her stories about his adventures. That made her choice more complicated, not simpler. Doctor? One of Morrison's men had entered the clinic despite her strict rule about sterile operating conditions. How's the boss? Margaret looked up from her patient to see a young man of perhaps 25, clean-shaven and well-dressed, in a way that suggested he was more than just hired muscle. His eyes held intelligence and calculation, probably Morrison's lieutenant rather than a common gunman. "He needs surgery immediately," she said. "The bullet is lodged against his shoulder blade. If I don't remove it soon, he'll either bleed to death or develop an infection that will kill him." "Then get to it, Doc. We don't have all day." Margaret set down her instruments and turned to face the young man directly. "Surgery requires sterile conditions, which means no one except my assistant in the operating room. You and your men will have to wait outside." "Not happening. We stay where we can see what you're doing." "Then Mr. Morrison dies from infection, assuming he survives the surgery at all." Margaret's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to having her medical decisions obeyed. "You can trust my professional judgment, or you can find another doctor. Those are your only options." The young man studied her face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. Margaret met his gaze steadily, projecting the calm confidence that had served her well during 15 years of frontier medical practice. "All right, Doc, but if something happens to him, something happens to you. Understood. Now get out of my operating room so I can save your boss's life." After the men left, Margaret locked the clinic door and closed the curtains, ensuring privacy for what she was about to do. Then she returned to the operating table where Frank Morrison lay unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. She could kill him now. A small slip of the scalpel, a nicked artery, an accidental hemorrhage that would look like a complication of surgery. His men would be angry, but they wouldn't be able to prove anything. She would have her revenge, and Morrison would finally pay for murdering her parents. But that would be too easy, too quick, too merciful for a man who'd spent 15 years profiting from violence while her parents rotted in unmarked graves. Margaret had spent those same 15 years preparing for this moment, and her plans went far beyond simple murder disguised as medical malpractice. She'd learned patience from her adoptive father, surgical precision from medical school, and strategic thinking from 15 years of tracking Frank Morrison's criminal activities. Frank Morrison was going to die for what he'd done to her family, but first he was going to pay for every other crime he'd committed. Every family he'd destroyed, every innocent person he'd hurt in pursuit of profit and power. Margaret began the surgery with hands that were now completely steady. She'd made her choice, and it wasn't the choice Morrison expected. She was going to save his life, and then she was going to destroy it completely. The bullet came out cleanly, along with bone fragments and torn tissue that had to be carefully cleaned from the wound. Margaret worked with the focused attention she'd developed during her medical training, repairing damage and stopping bleeding with practiced efficiency. But she also did something else during the surgery, something Frank Morrison would never suspect, and something his men couldn't see even if they'd been watching. She planted evidence. sewn into the muscle tissue of Morrison's shoulder, invisible to casual examination, but easily found by anyone who knew where to look, was a small oiled packet containing a list of names, dates, and locations. It was Margaret's. Documentation of Morrison's criminal activities over the past 15 years, including detailed accounts of murders, robberies, and other crimes. More importantly, it contained information about Morrison's current plans, a planned robbery of a federal gold shipment that would net his gang over $50,000. Information that Margaret had obtained through careful questioning of her network of contacts and informants. When Morrison recovered from surgery and left her clinic, he would be carrying evidence that would destroy him and his entire criminal organization. Evidence that Margaret planned to make sure found its way into the right hands at exactly the right time. The surgery took 3 hours. When it was finished, Morrison's shoulder was expertly repaired, and his life was no longer in immediate danger. Margaret bandaged the wound, administered a dose of morphine for pain, and settled down to wait for him to regain consciousness. Outside, Morrison's men had grown restless during the long surgery. She could hear them pacing on her clinic's front porch, occasionally calling out questions about their boss's condition. Margaret ignored them, focusing her attention on the man who'd murdered her parents and was about to discover that some debts took 15 years to collect. Frank Morrison's eyes opened as the sun was setting outside Margaret's clinic windows. He looked around the room with the automatic alertness of a man who'd survived decades of dangerous living, cataloging his surroundings and assessing potential threats. His gaze settled on Margaret, and she saw the moment when recognition dawned. He'd known he was coming to see Dr. Margaret Hayes, but he'd expected a stranger. Instead, he was looking at a face he remembered from his nightmares, if men like Frank Morrison were capable of having nightmares. "Hello, Uncle Frank," Margaret said quietly. "It's been a long time." Morrison tried to sit up, then grimaced as pain shot through his repaired shoulder. "Maggie Morrison. I thought you were dead." "I was, in a way. Maggie Morrison died the night you murdered her parents. I'm Dr. Margaret Hayes now." Morrison studied her face, looking for traces of the 12-year-old girl he'd tried to kill 15 years earlier. "You've done well for yourself, girl. Medical degree, successful practice. I'm proud of you." Margaret felt rage building in her chest at his casual tone, as if they were distant relatives catching up on family news instead of murderer and victim meeting after years of separation. "Are you? Are you proud that you created an orphan who had to claw her way through medical school with no family and no money? Are you proud that I spent 15 years wondering if the man who killed my parents was going to find me and finish what he started? Now, Maggie. It's Dr. Hayes. Maggie Morrison died with her parents." Morrison was quiet for a moment, assessing his situation. He was injured and confined to a clinic bed, with his enemy holding medical instruments that could easily become weapons. But he still had 3 armed men outside, and Margaret was still the same 12-year-old girl he remembered, just older and better educated. "What happens now, Dr. Hayes? You've saved my life, which suggests you're not planning immediate." "Revenge. Revenge is a luxury I can't afford. I have a medical practice to maintain, patients who depend on me, a reputation to protect." Margaret set down her instruments and met his gaze directly. "I took an oath to preserve life, even the lives of men who don't deserve to live. How noble of you, and very convenient for me. Perhaps, or perhaps saving your life was the cruelest thing I could do to you." Morrison's eyes sharpened. "What does that mean?" Margaret smiled, and for the first time since entering her clinic, she felt genuine satisfaction. "It means you're going to leave here thinking you've escaped justice, and you're going to discover that some traps take years to spring." Before Morrison could respond, his men began pounding on the clinic door. Margaret unlocked it and admitted the young man who'd spoken to her earlier, along with 2 other gunmen who looked like they'd been hired more for intimidation than intelligence. "How is he, Doc?" the young man asked, moving immediately to Morrison's bedside. "He'll leave. The surgery was successful, and there's no sign of infection. But he needs rest and proper care while the wound heals." Morrison struggled to sit up despite his lieutenant's protests. "Help me get dressed, Billy. We're leaving." "Boss, you just had surgery. The doc says you need rest." "I need to get out of this town before someone decides to ask uncomfortable questions about why we're here." Morrison's gaze never left Margaret's face. "Isn't that right, Dr. Hayes?" Margaret nodded. "Mr. Morrison is free to leave whenever he feels able. I've done everything I can for him medically." As Morrison's men helped him dress and prepare to leave, Margaret made sure to brush against his injured shoulder while checking his bandages. To anyone watching, it would look like a routine medical examination. In reality, she was making sure the evidence packet she'd sewn into his muscle tissue was properly positioned and secure. When Morrison left her clinic, he would be carrying the evidence that would eventually destroy him, and he would never know it was there. "Dr. Hayes," Morrison said as his men helped him toward the door, "this isn't over between us." "No, Uncle Frank, it's not. But it will be soon." After they left, Margaret sat alone in her clinic, feeling the weight of 15 years finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. She'd made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. Within a week, she would send coded messages to federal marshals in 3 territories, informing them about Frank Morrison's current location and his planned robbery of the federal gold shipment. She would also provide detailed information about his criminal organization, his methods of operation, and the evidence that could be found sewn into his shoulder if they captured him alive. Within a month, federal agents would surround Morrison's gang during their attempted robbery, using information only Dr. Margaret Hayes could have provided. Morrison would be captured alive, and during the medical examination required for all federal prisoners, the evidence packet in his shoulder would be discovered and used to build cases against his entire criminal network. Within a year, Frank Morrison would be tried and convicted for dozens of crimes spanning 15 years and 3 territories. The evidence Margaret had planted would lead to the arrest and conviction of corrupt officials who'd protected his operations, breaking up one of the largest criminal organizations in the American West. And within 2 years, Frank Morrison would die in federal prison, not from a bullet or a noose, but from an infection that developed in his shoulder wound, the same wound Dr. Margaret Hayes had so carefully repaired in her clinic. It would be ruled a medical complication, the kind of thing that sometimes happened when old wounds reopened under the stress of prison life. No one would ever connect it to the frontier doctor who'd saved Morrison's life and then planted the evidence that destroyed it. Margaret Hayes would never be charged with any crime, never even be suspected of orchestrating Morrison's downfall. She would continue her medical practice, serving the people of Colorado Territory with skill and compassion, earning the respect and gratitude of everyone who knew her. But she would also know that she'd kept the promise she'd made to her dying mother in her own way. She hadn't sought crude revenge against Frank Morrison. Instead, she'd built a good life far away from Wyoming, became someone who helped people instead of hurting them, and used her skills to ensure that justice finally caught up with her family's killer. It had taken 15 years, but the 12-year-old girl who'd watched her uncle murder, her parents had grown up to become exactly the right person to make sure he paid for his crimes. Dr. Margaret Hayes walked to her clinic window and watched Frank Morrison ride out of town with his men, heading toward what he thought was freedom but was actually the carefully constructed trap that would end his life and his criminal career. "Goodbye, Uncle Frank," she whispered to the night, "and thank you for teaching me that family loyalty works both ways." Behind her, the clock on her clinic wall chimed midnight, marking the end of the longest day of her life and the beginning of Frank Morrison's final chapter. Justice had been served with surgical precision,